you. And can you see my screen or no? Yeah, okay, perfect. I have it on a different monitor. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sophia, for introducing all of us. And I'm very much looking forward to speaking with all of you today. So I will go ahead and get started here. So today I will discuss my comparative project that explores the poems of 3 European Jewish poets, namely Susanna Ginczanka, Benjamin Heller, and Paul Celan. While these poets all cross into different literary traditions and languages, my research explores the ties they share, namely through their shared identity and persecution for being Jewish and their experiences of flight and exile. In this comparative reading, I will highlight excerpts from 3 poems written by these poets that delve into the timescape of Holocaust literature, exploring a heritage of exile presented by these poets, in which I deem to reveal 3 states of exile: internal, external, and linguistic exile. So in my thesis, I explore how these 3 poems deal with themes of heritage, exile, and hopelessness embroidered into the timescape of Holocaust literature, illuminating poetics of exile. Through the dual presence of the living and perishing body, the body becomes a site unto which internal, external, and even linguistic exile can be witnessed and felt, suggesting that in composing poetry during and about the Holocaust, language is the inheritance of the Jewish subject, reflecting on and extending beyond the body. In a longer study of these poems, I focus on the overwhelming language of heritage that underpin these poems, illustrated through the presence of the body that negotiates the status of exile, informed by Merleau-Ponty's body-subject theory in the phenomenology of perception. In this study, I conceptualize these poems from a semi-autobiographical perspective, intertwining the voice of the speaker and the poet. I explore Ginczanka's emerging authorship as a multilingual poet who composed poetry in Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish, nevertheless remaining stateless for her short-lived life and often referred to as Polish based on the language she chose to write in. Secondly, I explore the Polish-Jewish poet Benjamin Heller, who composed his poem Inheritance in Yiddish in Kazakhstan after fleeing the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1943. Finally, I turn to Celan as a multilingual Bukovina Jewish poet, exploring his uneasy relationship to sharing his native language with his oppressors, willing himself to craft a new version of the German language filled with metaphor and neologism. Through a close reading of these poems, I explore how the living and perishing body play a central role in exploring these types of exile. So I won't go through this whole quote here, but I just wanted you to see how I'm informed by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception and the relationship of perception and the body. And through this quote, I'm thinking of the subjective body as in the lived experience of the body and the embodiment of exile that is witnessed through the sight of the poetry. I also explore UNESCO's definition of intangible cultural heritage throughout this project as a basis for locating language as cultural heritage, which I then tie to the body, specifically the exiled body that houses language as a living extension of itself, and poetry an extension of the body. So I will start by going into Ginczanka. So Susanna Ginczanka, an interwar poet born in the Russian Empire in 1917 and hiding in Lviv during World War II, was arrested in 1942 by the Gestapo for the crime of being Jewish and was soon after murdered in a concentration camp. This poem, untitled and known primarily by the opening line, Non omnis moriar, she wrote upon discovering that her identity had been forsaken by her Aryan housekeeper and therefore can be seen as an autobiographical willing of her imprisonment into a tangible written form. The poem, lest for the opening line in Latin, a reference to the classical Roman poet Horace, is composed in Polish, a language she chose as her literary language, though her native language was Russian. In the poem, the precarious state of exile, in this case internal exile, is alluded to through the listing of materials that drench and overwhelm the poem, expressed through the listing of personal possessions that will be pillaged in a pogrom-like style, demonstrated in the excerpt on the following slide. Non omnis moriar, my proud estate, meadows of my tablecloths, fortresses of indomitable wardrobes, spacious sheets, precious bedding, and dresses, light dresses will be left after me. I did not leave any heir here. A frantic style of listing illustrates an in-motion image of flight for the reader, erupting at the end of the poem into a violent pogrom in which the blood and body of the speaker and the perpetrator become merged into one. The one stanza 24-line structure of the poem reads like a list, or more so a testament to her material possessions, which are all that will be left by her, as she leaves no heir, according to the poem. She also marks these possessions with a Jewish marking, altered in the translation from Jewish to simply J things. This element of assigning a category to the possessions as Jewish seeks to transgress a society that has already categorized her based on ethnic belonging. In this sense, her items or belongings become an extension of herself, as does the poem upon being written, serving a sort of heir unto which she can bestow her wealth and heritage against a society that has ripped her from her heritage. This is a full view of the poem, which I will not dwell on for the sake of time. So in my analysis, I look at how repetitive list making brings the reader closer to the act of physical flight. I look at how materials represent the mass wealth that was stolen and the physical ransacking of the body, specifically the Jewish body. I look at the passive to active voice as an act of witnessing one's own demise and impending death. And in the absence of heir, the poem becomes heir. And I look at how material wealth is marked by a J, or in some cases Jewish, suggesting a heritage and a final act of defiance. Next, I will look to the Polish-Jewish poet Binyam Heller's poem composed during his exile in Kazakhstan in 1943 and published in Warsaw in 1948 in the collection Durch Schatten und Schein. The reader is informed of where this poem was written by Heller's choice to state the year and location of the poem in the manuscript form, signaling a theme of external exile. Heller's three-stanza, 19-line poem calls into question the notion of inheritance for the Jewish exiled subject and uses the emotive quality of hatred as a form of intangible heritage that can and must be passed on to his heirs, and arguably an entire generation of post-Holocaust descendants as a cautionary tale of brutal survival, thus becoming embodied heritage. Heritage and inheritance is revealed as an intangible feeling of hatred rather than a tangible heritage, such as property tied to a monetary value. Further, physical body parts act as border zones in the poem to separate the Jewish and non-Jewish subject, almost Talmudic in form, as he warns the addressee to keep separate from the German insofar as by the body and breath. I will not leave my heirs all that I have inherited, only one thing, my hatred, my painful hatred, which rushes from my heart to my eyes in a wave of blood, as he continues on. The very first line of the poem identifies heritage as the crux of the poem, with the focus towards inheritance, Yerusha, and inherited, Geyarshant. However, it is within the second line that this inheritance is revealed as an intangible emotion rather than a tangible form, suggesting that there can be no reparation for the crime that was committed unto the speaker and crimes unto the nearly erased generation of European Jewish society. Rather, this pain is transformed in a sort of embodied hopelessness into hatred for the society that murdered, cast out, and displaced a generation of people. Secondly, physical body parts are referred to, such as heart, eye, blood, as physical border zones that allow the inheritance of hatred to cross from the speaker to the heir in this poem, suggesting that exile can be felt within the physical body, moving from intangible to a tangible category of heritage, and likely reflecting Heller's own experience. This is a full view of the poem that I will not dwell on. In my analysis, I look at physical body parts that are listed as physical border zones, allowing an intangible feeling of hatred, sinne, to be inherited through the body. Language acts as an inheritance through the language of the poem, tied to a specific Yiddish speaking or suggestive of a Jewish audience, and breath, blood, and body suggest a lasting displacement to be inherited. Finally, my next and final reading will be of Paul Celan's post-Shoah poem, Tenebrae, written in 1957 and published in the collection Sprachgitter. This poem is arguably located within the timescape of the Shoah in terms of the content and tone of the poem. In my reading of the poem, I explore the presence of the body suggestive of the subjective body rather than the objective body. That is, quote, the body as it is lived, body as an embodied consciousness, according to Merleau-Ponty. Although more lyrical and abstract than both Heller and Ginczanka's poems of flight, I argue that this poem explores the theme of embodied exile, a lost heritage, and physical suffering that positions itself within the Holocaust and can be read alongside Heller and Ginczanka. We are near, Lord, near and at hand, handled already, Lord, clawed and clawing as though the body of each of us were your body, Lord. In this excerpt of the first two stanzas of the 22-line poem, the heavily Christological imagery and Roman Catholic title of the poem suggest a motif of lament. However, my reading explores how the poem inverts Christian form of worship and reveals a sort of communal suffering that is not redeemed nor healed in the poem. Celan uses the body of the Lord, Herr, typically associated with a Christian god, and ties the body of God to the bodies of the subject, intimately drawing on the fleshy body filled with blood, which ties into both Ginczanka and Heller, who both speak of blood mixing and warnings of blood mixing in their poems of flight. Additionally, Celan uses the image of blood in a repetitive function, symbolizing a transient movement the poem is located in, but never arrives to a destination. Further, a ritualistic act of drinking accompanies the second stanza of the poem, seeming to suggest a post-Holocaust mourning which is tied to the body through lyrical language. The communion of drinking does not fulfill the communal thirst of the subject, rather leaves the mouths of the subject empty and dry, suggesting a sense of perpetual exile and trauma after the Shoah, in which language is tied to heritage as the physical body and culture have been destroyed. What then remains other than language as heritage? This is a full look of the poem in translation. In my analysis, I look at the body of the Lord and perishing body of the subjects and how they are intertwined into one body. I look at the fleshy body and presence of blood and drinking of blood that occurs throughout the poem. I look at the ritualistic act of drinking, though thirst can never be quenched, even through a quote-unquote communion, and I look at how language acts as inheritance. In my concluding thoughts, I look at how these poems offer important insight into themes of flight, hopelessness, and the negotiation of heritage inherent to exile literature. I look at how the body is engaged as metaphor, even as an interplace to convey a sense of passage, flight, as well as exile to which that passage leads, place. And I look at the body, which is either in a process of living or perishing, and how it is extended into the genesis of the poem, allowing for an inheritance that is made by the body, but exists beyond the body. Finally, in conclusion, I look at how Ginczanka articulates an internal exile from which she would only escape in death, how Heller explores an external exile that manifests itself through othering and animosity, and how Celan illuminates a post-Shoah exile that is permanently altered in trauma and marked by a willful change in language. Each of these poems, albeit suggesting a dark heritage, will themselves to be told, suggesting that exile poetry of the Holocaust can and does exist as an extension of the body and as a form of heritage for the exiled 20th century European Jewish subject. And these are some of the sources that I am looking at. Thank you very much.